looking at the seminal grounded theory texts or books that define how we understand grounded theory at this year. So it started with the discovery of grounded theory by Glaser and Strauss in 1967 when they studied the art of dying, awareness of dying, meaning their research is actually how people perceive what the experiences of people who are mamamatay na. So that's they discovered the method na they will define this or will use the grounded theory as a methodology. Then it was followed by theoretical sensitivity by Glaser again. Again, there is a qualitative analysis for social scientists, which Strauss has been started. Actually, Strauss is the advisor of Glaser. Glaser at that time is the student, and the advisor of Glaser is Strauss. But Strauss is more on qualitative analysis. So his interpretation of the grounded theory is actually defining it as a qualitative research for social scientists. The vague approach of Glaser actually defined by Strauss and Corbin in their Basics of Qualitative Research, Grounded Theory Procedures and Techniques, because they have seen that grounded theory is actually the way to gather and analyze data. And this was really opposed by Glaser in the book of Basics of Grounded Theory Analysis and the following book or arguments that the Glaser has been shared in conferences or other papers. But what's good with Strauss and Corbin is that they structure the process of doing the grounded theory. Later on, Charmas defined the constructivist grounded theory because this was neglected on the Glaser and Strauss approach of grounded theory, meaning they don't define the philosophical stance behind grounded theory. So Charmas put that we can add a constructivist grounded theory. That means they refer to a political a stance or the philosophical stance behind doing the grounded theory research. And there are also other grounded theory approaches such as situational analysis. Another variation of grounded theory, as many researchers adopted the original and the modified one, which is the original, which is the classic grounded theory by Glaser. And the Strauss and Corbin paper, Strauss and Corbin on the structured or modified, maybe the grounded theory, and the rest of the recent grounded theory adoption, where they could also term there is an action research in grounded theory, the constructivist grounded theory of Charmas. And so there's a lot of derived methods, derived approach on how to employ grounded theory on their paper or in their research. So let's move on to at least you have an idea on how they differ in terms of the grounded theory and how their approach is. But this one will only give us some terms about grounded theory and the terms or the process of analyzing data. They describe here, we have 4 phases, and especially this is your first assignment, is to discover the process on how to conduct grounded theory. But this one is a comparison between Strauss and Corbin approach of doing grounded theory and the Glaser approach or Glasser approach of grounded theory. So we have 4 phases described as initial coding, immediate coding, final development, and theory building, or just a theory. So there are various terms used by group depending on which approach you will be adopting. We have Strauss and Corbin. They use open coding or use of analytical technique, while Glaser defined this as a substantive coding, which use data dependent. So meaning, in use of analytical technique, you might be framed with the field where you came from. No? So for example, if your degree is related to business, that means you will be oriented with how you code in the business approach, while the substantive coding of Glaser doesn't define actually in which in which orientation you came from. And during the intermediate coding, Strauss and Corbin introduced the eggshell coding. This would be defined here as the reduction and clustering of categories. And eggshell coding will help you define the major categories needed to define your theory as a process. So this is a helpful tool also for individuals or grounded theory researchers who have difficulty organizing the codes they have derived during the open coding. While Glaser emphasizes on continuous with previous phase comparison with focus on data, becoming more abstract categories refitted emerging frameworks. That means Glaser advocated that we don't need a guide on how to analyze data, but we analyze more on the process while data gathering, meaning we are very dependent to the data that we have derived from the substantive coding and refine it as we add more data. No? Unlike in the Strauss and Corbin approach, where when you have something like a structure that has been formed from your data and data gathering and analysis, you will be given an aid, which we call the eggshell coding, that will help you cluster or define the categories within your codes. While in the Glaser, you must be confident enough to trust your data that somehow later it will become a framework, or you will realize the interconnection of the various categories or concepts that arise from the data. So that's the Glaser. And during the final development, we have Strauss and Corbin. We call this selective coding, meaning detailed development of categories, selection of core, integration of categories. In the selective coding is that you decide that you will focus only on items that I've seen before and ignore the rest, meaning you're focused here on the refinement and integration of the concept that you have derived from data, while Glaser is actually theoretical, refitting and refinement of categories which integrate around emerging core. In the theoretical coding, you need to define one major categories that you need to refine within around the theory, meaning you at this theoretical coding, you define the perspective in which part you will be focusing on your categories or the concept that arise from your data. And the last is the theory phase, is that detailed and dense process fully described. That means you've already defined the different indicators of that theory, while Glaser emphasized on parsimony, scope, and modifiability. That means you can continuously develop the theory itself, because the simpler itself or the focus on the scope or the context might be what might be the way in your theory will be known or developed in the future. Yeah. So as of now, you might have limited understanding on these things because we have a discussion on what's an open coding and how to use that in analyzing data, what's an eggshell coding, although we don't use that one because I'll be adapting a combination of Strauss and Corbin and Glaser, because unfortunately, Glaser is sometimes vague about the description of how he conducted the method, while Strauss and Corbin provide us with a more structured instruction on how to conduct the data analysis. But somehow in my assignment later, in our first requirement, is that we combine this concept to be able to derive a theoretical approach, derive our approach or process on how we will conduct research considering the context or the problem that we will be taking, or we call this substantive area. So let's focus now on the core tenets of grounded theory. Here, I want to emphasize that despite the process that I've given and the different phases of conducting the grounded theory, we focus on the core tenets so that when you derive the process itself, you focus on these two things. We have only two. I will only introduce two core process that makes the grounded theory unique among qualitative research methods. First is the constant comparison, and the second one is the theoretical sampling. Let's start with constant comparison. Constant comparison is I think you have already background on research. So how do we perform constant comparison? So let's start with, it's hard to describe actually. So let's start with, we have an initial data gathered to one participant, okay? So that when you analyze the data about the participant, the first participant, you somehow put notes on each of the item that you've derived, the concept that was described to you by your participants. So that's the coding part. No, whereas that you have the data collection, then you have the note taking process. So meaning you have data collection is maybe you conducted an interview, then you have notes. The coding process is actually labeling each of the notes that you have taken during the interview, or the transcript itself. The ano talaga ang sinasabi niya, you put a code, and how the process of coding will be described later as an example in one of our maybe online workshops. So we have to code, meaning you have to label each of the statement that the participants has been shared to you, and you also have hindi masyadong clear, no, but that's memoing, meaning memo tapos ing. These are actually your realization of what your participants has been shared to you, and you conduct again the data collection. No, this is the process. So if you are a researcher, you start with data collection, note taking, coding, and memoing on your first participant. No? Tapos you recruit another participants and conduct the same. But at this time, when you do the open coding, you keep on comparing the concept that you have derived from your first participants to a first participant to your next participant. So this is the concept of constant comparison, such that the concepts that you derive from the first participant or your respondent, and the concept that you derive from your second participant or respondents will become one concept, no? So you combine your analysis of the first participant and the second participant, then you recruit the third participant. And again, when you analyze the data from your third participant, you keep on comparing if there are repeating concepts that shared by the participants based on your question. So the idea of constant comparison is that while you conduct a data collection method, you also analyze the data that is shared to you. So that's the constant comparison. Unlike in the normal qualitative research, is that you have this questionnaire, semi-structured normally. You keep on collecting data, no? Then you summarize all the collected data. Now, in the concept of constant comparison is that you keep on looking for some patterns by comparing the various participants. No? So you might, example, if you are already in your 8th participant and one concept actually emerged and you've realized at this point, you can go back to the first one if that concept is actually present. So meaning you keep on comparing, simple lang, constant comparison gani. You keep on comparing the concepts or the data that you try to identify pattern by comparing. And this is a normal process as a human being. We keep on determining patterns in anything. That's the reason that maybe we have survived at this point in life, because we keep on determining patterns of our life. And it's simpler to process our brain if we can already identify a pattern to a certain thing. And the way we understand the concept or the data that is shared by our participants is through constant comparison. So even if you are doing on the 40th participants, you keep on comparing, and maybe not really comparing from 39, 38, but you keep on comparing the emerging concept. No? That's the constant comparison principle. That means it must always be present. It must be present in your method. Let's move on to the second important concept on the grounded theory, the theoretical sampling. The idea of theoretical sampling is the way we recruit our participants, the way we identify will be the next who will answer our interview, or if that's your method, or in which part in who will be your target participants or who will be your target respondents. That's the target, that's the purpose of theoretical sampling. So when you start your data, gathering, we call that initial sampling. No, so meaning, in other words, we can call this process as purposive sampling, meaning you define what you believe is the most resourceful person to share to you about the substantive area or the area of your study. So, for example, in my case, I'm studying online freelancer, software developer, online software developer. So those who are working online as a software developer, meaning an online, kaya nga online software developer, no ba? So, I define my first initial. So that's initial sampling, or we can call this in common qualitative research as purposive sampling. We define the characteristic of the participants where we think can share to us more about working as an online software developer. So in my part, I believe that if you have a 5-year, if you have at least 3-year experience working as an online software developer, you might be a good respondent of my study. And you are living in Iligan City. No. I think that's the only criteria that I've defined. And that would be, I use this noble sampling. The idea, no, but this is a purposive sampling. So this one, the idea of this one is that I describe a participant, and when I randomly encounter in the web or on my friends that they satisfy this requirement, they will be the first participant, or the respondent of my study. So I will interview them, ask them about their experience and work, and after that, I will analyze the data. Once I analyze the data and conducted my notes and memos and realization, I now need to clarify things based on the data that I gathered. Those questions that will arise from my coding, and the coding may be shared later, those process or those concept that arise from my coding and from the analysis of my first participant will be used to determine who will be my next participant. And that is what we call theoretical sampling. So how is it different from the purposive sampling? The purposive sampling in conducting research is actually we will define our participant or our respondent of the study. So for example, we will study about women who ages 40 to 60 up. That means all your respondents would be that characteristic, meaning they will have a 60 years old and up and other criteria. But that would maintain for all your participants the conditions or the criteria of selecting the participants is true to all. That's purposive sampling. The theoretical sampling is that every data gathering has a different set of criteria. No? So meaning the theoretical sampling can simply be defined as a dynamic purposive sampling. Okay, so that's the theoretical sampling. That means these are the two tenets that we need to employ, meaning all grounded theory must have some way of doing a constant comparison and at the same time theoretical sampling. Okay, I think that's it for this lecture. And because after this one, I will assign you to read a paper. I will ask you about the methodology approach later during our online discussion next meeting. Okay, thank you for your attention.